Good morning. Your Excellency, President of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Cyprus, Your Excellency, President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, honorable ministers, distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, dear guests. Welcome to this very essential and urgent OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Conference. My name is Nicolas, and I will be your moderator for this first session. Allow me a few technical announcements before we move into the substantive part of our deliberations. The meeting is being recorded and live streamed. Simultaneous interpretation in English and French is provided. English is on channel 1, and French interpretation is on channel 2. If you have any trouble with your headsets, just raise your hand and a member of the staff will assist you. Those who will speak from a written text are kindly requested to provide a copy to the Secretariat desk in order to facilitate our interpreters' work. Your Excellencies, dear guests, this conference is hosted by the Cyprus House of Representatives as a sign of its institutional commitment to exerting every effort to combat corruption. It is a conference that will hear and debate how democratic institutions have had to grapple with one of the most pressing issues of our time. Corruption has, unfortunately, become a twisted institution in itself. It sits within our democratic institutions, eroding them, feeding off them, and generating public mistrust. There is a lot to cover today. Allow me to call to the podium the person who took the initiative for organizing this conference, OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Vice President and Special Representative on Fighting Corruption, Mrs. Irini Charalambidis, to deliver her welcoming remarks.
Your Excellencies, honorable ministers, distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished speakers, dear colleagues, dear guests. I'm so glad to welcome you all to Cyprus, to my beautiful country. Thank you for coming. Hopefully, the next 2 days will be quite productive when it comes to sharing knowledge and learning about good practices in preventing and fighting corruption. We have been planning that as OSCE for a long time, and unfortunately, due to the outbreak of COVID-19, we had to postpone this conference for 2 years. Within the framework of my first and now the second mandate as OSCE Special Representative on combating corruption, I keep repeating that political will is the key tool against corruption. There are too many politicians in this room who have the power to make a change, to promote the idea and ensure implementation of adequate legislation. We need to constantly reinforce our relations with international stakeholders in the field of combating corruption and share their knowledge. This conference serves precisely the purpose of sending a strong message of our determination as parliamentarians to be better informed, more ambitious regarding our anti-corruption agenda, and more effective in order to meet our citizens' expectations. Many thanks to our guest speakers for making the time and effort, since some of them had to fly from the USA in order to share their knowledge and experience with us and answer to our questions and concerns. Our guest speakers are top experts representing the most important international organizations dealing with combating corruption on a daily basis. Their presence here today has been the result of intensive contacts and consultations. Since my appointment as Special Representative of the OSCPA, I tried hard to reinforce communication channels between the OSCPA and competent international organizations, NGOs, experts, and investigative journalists. Also, our efforts was to reinforce OSCPA relations with the OSCE executive structures, namely the Special Representative on Fighting Corruption of the OSCE Chairperson in Office, Mrs. Anita Ramasastri, and the Coordinator of the Economic and Environmental Activities, Ambassador Ingli Hassani, on whom I very much count for exploring new avenues for action to the benefit of OSCE, including the OSCPA. And that will be to the benefit of our citizens. I sincerely hope that combating corruption will remain a top priority on the agenda of every rotating OSCE chairmanship, and I wish to express my great appreciation to the current Polish OSCE chairmanship for their support to this conference. Your Excellency, Ambassador Moczowski, thank you for your presence here on behalf of His Excellency, the Polish Foreign Minister. My dearest Margarita Sederfeld, President of the OSCPA, our closer cooperation started with co-sponsoring a supplementary item on corruption for our annual assembly in Luxembourg back in 2019. Since then, we have been great allies with a common goal to spread the word that combating corruption demands determination, strong will from national parliaments, and through all the tough times, even when we had to postpone this conference, my dearest OSCE Secretary General, Roberto Mondella, made sure that that we would do everything that we could within our powers for this conference to take place, providing all necessary support by the International Secretariat, our staff in Vienna, who worked close with the International Relations Service of the Cyprus House of Representatives. For a small parliament to host an event as big as this one has been a real challenge. Certainly, this conference would not have been taking place without the keen and full support of Her Excellency, the President of the House of Representatives, Mrs. Anita Dimitriou. With these words, I wish that the conference will be fruitful and productive, composing ideas, sharing knowledge, and exchanging good practices. Your Excellency, my dearest friend Anita Dimitriou, the floor is yours, please. Thank you. Congratulations. Thank you, dearest.
Your Excellency, the President of ΟΑΣΕ Parliamentary Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, honorable ministers, honorable speakers, distinguished members of the diplomatic corps, dear colleagues, dear guests, welcome to the House of Representatives of the Republic of Cyprus. It is really an honor and a great pleasure for the Cyprus House of Representatives to host an international conference on such an important theme, gathering so many parliamentarians from ΟΑΣΕ, participating states and partners for cooperation. I wish to particularly thank Cypriot officials from independent state institutions, representatives of international organizations leading anti-corruption efforts, as well as NGOs, investigative journalists, with expertise in the field of their practice, of their presence here today, and for their significant contribution to our debates. First and foremost, my warm thanks to the soul of the conference, to the OASE PA Vice President and Special Representatives on Fighting Corruption, my dear colleague Irini Charalambidis, for your initiative to bring this conference to Cyprus and her active involvement in every step for the process. Mr. Charalambidis, you are the soul of this conference and you know that. Dear participants, corruption ranks among high of the main concerns of citizens, particularly youth, leading to their disillusionment, disaffection, and abstention from political activity and public life. As parliamentarians, we have the duty to gain back our credibility and reliability in the eyes of our citizens. As legislators and guarantors of their rights and interests, we must ensure effective oversight to strengthen democratic institutions and to promote good governance, transparency, and accountability. Corruption can have devastating effects in our societies and social cohesion. It distorts markets and competition, corrodes the rule of law, undermines government legitimacy, breeds cynicism among citizens, and nourishes populism. What is more, corruption can have a geopolitical impact when used as a tool by foreign powers to buy influence and to advance their foreign policy agendas. International organizations play a crucial role in global efforts to combat corruption. The United Nations is monitoring the implementation of the only universal legal instrument against corruption and has included reducing corruption and bribery among its 17 SDGs. The World Bank made anti-corruption efforts part of its programming. The Council of Europe Group of States Against Corruption is providing member states with detailed recommendations how to improve control of corruption. The OASE is including anti-corruption in its field missions program. The leading NGO Transparency International is conducting analysis and advocacy worldwide, while the international media report instances of corruption not without risk on a daily basis. The fact that no country is immune to corruption is a painful truth, but certainly not an excuse. Corruption is not an unchangeable reality, but rather a task at hand. It is precisely this message we must communicate to our citizens through our debates and exchanges, benefiting from the experience and best practices of one another. The 3 sessions of the conference aim at highlighting the key policies and the different roles of main actors in efforts to combat corruption, including national parliaments, independent state institutions, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and of course the media. As for the challenges, efforts must be collective to the multifaceted nature and complexity of this phenomenon. Greater inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability must be our primary incentive and our ultimate goal among this difficult path. I will not shy away from recognizing my own country's weakness or shortfalls because this is a recipe for failure. As traumatizing such experience may be for eternal politicians and public confidence, they make us stronger and more determined to find solutions. In the past 18 months, the House has adopted a code of conduct for Member of Parliament, legislation on the protection of whistleblowers, it was Mrs. Charalambidis' initiative, legislation on lobbying and legislation for an independent authority against corruption, which has been granted all the necessary powers to successfully carry out its important duties. And thank you, the President of the Committee, of the Law Committee. He's here today with us, and they are doing an excellent work, trying to catch up the deadlines and implementing into force all the law reforms. An authority with its own budget, a unique procedure for the appointment of its members that eliminates undue influence and extensive investigative powers to examine and assess information about possible acts of corruption. Another law regulates lobbying by providing that official must inform the aforementioned authority of all meetings they have with persons wishing to be involved in the decision-making process. Legislation on whistleblowers' protection places an obligation for the competent authorities to designate independent and autonomous external channels for receiving and managing information, as well as the obligation to process such information. All the bills, as well as the Code of Conduct, have been the result of a collective effort, and allow me to thank all my colleagues for that, and of a constructive dialogue that took place of an atmosphere of consensus and goodwill beyond party politics and independent authorities. We have together, Mr. Mihailidis, we have today a lot of people that participated to this long process effort, and thank them particularly for their support. Obviously, we do not expect that with the adoption of the legislation, corruption will be, immediately the corruption will be eradicated once for all. But we now have better tools to prevent corruption, to find out about it, to bring relevant cases to justice, and also to train our administration to recognize them so that they can be better addressed. We are looking forward to more concrete suggestions on possible improvements, and I'm confident that we will hear some by the end of this conference. I welcome you once again to Cyprus. I wish you every success to your deliberations, and we are really pleasant to have you here, honored to have you here. Thanks again, my colleague, Mrs. Irini Charalambidis, and thank you all for being here, and wishing you to have a pleasant stay to our beautiful island. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam President. National parliaments, through their legislative work, oversight, and representation functions, have a central role to play in fighting corruption. International parliamentary organizations offer a platform for continuous dialogue, re-evaluation, exchange of best practices, positive pressure, as well as peer support between parliamentarians. Preventing corruption and promoting transparency, good governance, and accountability constitute top priorities for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. May I now invite to the podium Her Excellency, the President of the OSCE PA, Mrs. Margarita Setterfeld, for her opening address.
Honorable Madam President of the House of Representatives, distinguished Minister, Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Secretary General, members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all thank you all for attending this important conference. Our presence today confirms that fighting corruption is a security priority across the OSCE region. As it is a serious undermines states' development and impacts citizens' lives. There is a war in Ukraine. We are working and supporting peace-building stability, but we have also to continue with all the other very important issues. If we forget them, there will be much more problem when the war is ended. And I would like to congratulate and thank you to the steadfast commitment of Ms. Irini Charalambidis, OSCE PA Vice President and Special Representative on fighting corruption. With your efforts to bring new political momentum to our good governance and show that it's possible to make changes. And I know when I appointed you as special representatives that there should be activity, that you shouldn't just sit and make reports. You should also act. Thank you for this. And I would like to mention here that Ms. Irene Charlambides not only have taken initiative to this conference, she has also taken a very important initiative which might put OSCE PA in the forefront when it comes to countering corruption. It's a code of conduct which will involve all members of parliament who are members of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, involve the members of the Secretariat as well. And I hope that we will be ready to adapt this later on, not here for the conference, of course, it needs to be a proper procedure, but I see this as a very important step forward. And allow me to commend the President of the Parliament of Cyprus, Ms. Demetriou, and its amazing staff, for hosting us for the 2 days. And thank you also for arranging this important conference, the first fully in-person meeting since the outbreak of the COVID for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And I must say, the conference is already a success. I noticed all the discussion yesterday at the reception, also outside here, and I could feel in the air that there is a high expectations for the upcoming 2 days. And this is also the first fully conference in OSCE PA focusing on countering corruption. I would also like to express my thanks to our expert guests and speakers. I and my colleagues, we look forward to listen to you, to reflect about your comments, your speeches, and also bring the new knowledge with us in our parliamentarian work. And I would like to express our gratitude to Secretary General Montella and the staff of the International Secretariat for all your efforts to not only to this conference, but always your readiness to support the work of the delegates of OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Corruption, it's a very serious threat to the rule of law and stability of our societies. It affects all states in the world by undermining fundamental democratic value, institutions, and also have an impact on the social economy as well as the political development. It diverts critical resources from addressing our citizens' needs, and it alienates us from our democratic process. And I would like to be very frank here. Let us be clear, corruption is a very, very serious crime. And as when it comes to all serious crimes, we as parliamentarians need to act, to be responsible, because that's why we are elected. That's the trust that our voters, our citizens, have shown in us when we were elected. And it's our duty to show this respect to the democratic institution. In the fight against corruption, the role of parliamentarians is pivotal. And it's because, of course, we have the legislative oversight. We adopt the laws. We have representational functions. And we, as members of national parliament, a lot of us are also members of international organizations. This gives us the possibility to act international, but this gives also it gives us the responsibility to make the laws, to also to scrutinize the government and to follow up that the laws are implemented, and to develop the legislations, to make a sign to our government that now it's time to come for a new proposal because there is new threats. The corruption have found new ways. But I would also like to say that organization like OSCE PA, it's a fantastic organization. It facilitates the dynamic interaction of parliamentarians. From the whole region, from 57 countries, from Vladivostok to Vancouver. And by this, it means that we have a fantastic way and opportunity to have impact on international level and bring, not only give others, also to bring with us home the experience from others' success. And notably, the OSCE PA 2019, the resolution, the role of national parliamentarians in preventing and combating corruptions, provides a solid policy framework for parliamentarians on matters of corruption. It calls on parliaments to intensify efforts to develop anti-corruption legislations, including criminalizing all possible forms of corruption and adhering to strict transparency, accountability stance. And I say this just as Madam President have said before, transparency is a strong factor for accountability, as well as free media, a vibrant civil society, and the transparency. And I would go back to our everyday duties as parliamentarians. When we are not attending the conference, when we are not on the international arena, when we are back home in our national parliaments, because it's there we adopt the legislation. And it's there we should focus our work. But I would also like to say that we shouldn't be shy of this. We should speak out and say that we need the legislation, that we have also statistics that we could count on, that there are organizations in the civil society that have very important statistics, resources, and also knowledge that we can take part of, just as we will do here for 2 days. And there is also very important question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think this is the start. What is corruption? What is the root for corruption? Why is there corruption? What can we do? It seems easy questions, but it's not. Because it's also involved us as persons, us as parliamentarians. When there is a gift on the table, when there is a free dinner, is there such things? Is there a free travel? What are we expected to bring back? This is the start, because it's not only that. It would be to make it too easy. It's just the start of the trip to counter corruption. And I would also say that OSCE, its fundament, the Helsinki Final Act, adopted 1975, and also the European Security Order, with its broader perspective on security. It's involved all aspects, its politics, its agreement, its economy, its environment, its human rights. And in this framework is corruption a natural pillar. And to conclude, I am confident that this conference will be a good opportunity, a good start to jointly assess progress in our anti-corruption efforts to date. I invite you all to share relevant expertise and consider effective policies in the fight against corruption. Fighting corruption have to remain a top priority in all OSCE member countries and a question for all parliamentarians and governments. And this is the key to defend our democracy and stay true to our values and to those who have elected us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Sederfeld, for your passion and for posing the critical questions. Elected governments are a central part in this democratic process and thereby a key actor in fostering transparency and accountability. I would thus like to invite to the podium His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cyprus, Mr. Ioannis Kassoulidis, for his opening remarks.
Madam President of the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE, Madam President of the House of Representatives of Cyprus, Mr. Secretary General of the OSCE, honorable members of national parliaments here present, Your Excellencies, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me at the outset to thank and congratulate the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for organizing and hosting this significant conference in Cyprus. As we recognize the efforts and work of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly is investing in boosting transparency, accountability, and support of democratic institutions in the fight against corruption, your presence signifies the increasing importance we all attach on this subject matter. The seismic events unfolding before us will have long-lasting effects on the broader region and beyond, and are certainly testing the resilience of multilateralism. Cyprus has been a long-standing advocate of the intrinsic value of multilateralism. We therefore firmly believe that the deepening of such efforts and the promotion of initiatives such as today's one are more necessary than ever. The paramount importance of multilateral cooperation has always been recognized by OSCE, and we must redouble our efforts in ensuring that our commitment to it never waves. Corruption poses a substantial threat to the foundation of a transparent, accountable, and multilateral system, and to the very foundations of our democratic states. It undermines the rule of law, weakens the legitimacy of institutions, and erodes the confidence of our citizens towards the political world. The contemporary crisis regarding the lack of trust of our citizens to our own institutions is deeply connected to the spread of corruption. Therefore, anti-corruption efforts should form an integral part of a comprehensive approach to these burning issues of our times, which have the potential to undermine the effectiveness of multilateral cooperation. It is our shared responsibility to combat corruption and encourage and control and scrutinize governments and parliaments to collaborate and create synergies on this effort. Dear friends, the significance of parliaments as a partner to our common objective to eradicate corruption and strengthen the institutions and regulations necessary for its achievement cannot be stressed enough. Our own country has regrettably not been spared by this scourge. However, out of these difficulties and setbacks, we have learned and we have improved. As is always the case, and for all countries, this is an ongoing process which requires constant vigilance and complete dedication. All of us stand to learn from each other in enhancing transparency and accountability. And this event today is a perfect opportunity to share and exchange views which will facilitate our efforts. For this, I commend the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and the organizers, and in particular, Mrs. Irini Haralambidou. Irini, Member of Parliament, Vice President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, has been given deservedly the role of special representatives in fighting corruption, if I judge from her passionate and dedication in this field, acting as a national member of parliament in Cyprus. In closing, allow me to reiterate Cyprus's deep appreciation to all of you and your participation and contributions. I am confident that your deliberations will have a high added value in further advancing our joint efforts and goals. I wish you every success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your address. As a clear indication of the steadfast commitment of the current OSCE Polish chairpersonship to the cause of preventing and combating corruption, Special Envoy Ambassador Artur Tmochowski is here to address our conference. Mr. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished members of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the OSCE Chairman in Office, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Professor Zbigniew Rau, let me express my gratitude for organizing this important event. I am particularly pleased to welcome the Chair's Special Representative, Professor Anita Ramasastry, who will elaborate further on the specific outcomes of the Chair's activities in the field of anti-corruption. It's such an honor to speak amongst such a distinguished panel. The parliamentary dimension of the OSCE and the Assembly itself is strengthening multilateralism and promoting conflict prevention through dialogue. And today, this task may have greater and more important meaning than ever. Ladies and gentlemen, from the very beginning, the OSCE has been designed to prevent another war on the continent. For many years, in the midst of many turbulences, we could all have been convinced that our common endeavor helps to protect security and stability of the continent and dignity of human beings. Yet, in the face of such an unprecedented breach of the international order, like the current Russia's unprovoked, brutal aggression against Ukraine, we realize that the very foundations of the OSCE have been shaken. The scale of violations of international law, including humanitarian and human rights, is enormous. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Poland, as the chair of the OSCE, has taken a firm stance in defense of the organization's values and principles, which touch upon such fundamental norms like sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, and freedom to choose alliances by individual countries. And the international community has repeatedly called on Russia to stop the atrocities and allow the humanitarian effort to be stepped up. In the longer perspective, we also aspire to keep the focus of the organization in areas that over the years we have collectively developed as OSCE's unique experience and expertise in all its three dimensions. The strength of the OSCE lies in its comprehensive approach to the concept of security, which takes into account political and military, economic and environmental aspects, as well as human rights. Only then, when developed properly, can we achieve solid foundations of stability and sustainable economic and political growth. Today's setting enables an open discussion and a valuable exchange of national perspectives with a view to increase trust and further strengthen our cooperation in the OSCE area. Especially in the current situation, we cannot forget what this organization has achieved so far. Especially in the current situation, in the context of today's meeting, it has been fostering good governance and anti-corruption measures by adopting a whole set of Ministerial Council decisions and publishing its documents. The Polish OSCE chairmanship regards the fight against corruption as a cornerstone of a modern democratic society. It is one of key priorities in the economic and environmental dimension. Therefore, we decided to include a thematic focus on anti-corruption measures and efforts to increase transparency, openness, and good governance in all meetings of the 2022 Economic and Environmental Forum cycle. Ladies and gentlemen, corruption is a phenomenon occurring in all regions of the world. It is not only a problem of criminal behavior, but also and above all, a structural issue. It causes social, economic, and political implications that can undermine the basic fabric of our societies. By enhancing good governance, state authorities increase their democratic legitimacy, boost their economy, prevent social injustice, and ultimately promote greater security. The fight against corruption at all levels plays an important role in the promotion and protection of human rights, and in the process of creating sustainable, effective, accountable, and transparent institutions to achieve the full implementation of human rights. This issue is even more timely, considering the crisis situations like the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as political turmoil, provide especially fertile grounds for illegal activities that can threaten democratic institutions and stability in all participating states. It is crucial that the violations and abuses of human rights and democratic institutions in the OSCE area, including in particular those stemming from the Russian aggression against Ukraine, are thoroughly discussed and brought to the attention of the wider public opinion. As for Ukraine, also in the post-war rehabilitation period, transparency and determination of our actions will be essential to sustain public trust in governmental and multilateral efforts. The United Nations, Council of Europe, and OSCE are increasingly aware of the adverse effects of that corruption has on the implementation of human rights mechanisms and safeguards. Combating corruption requires a coherent, holistic approach that seeks to prevent and suppress corrupt behavior. The Parliamentary Assembly and parliamentarians have a special role and exceptionally strong legitimacy received directly from their societies. I strongly believe that national parliaments, as the pillars of democracy, can play a crucial role in the field of combating corruption. Those activities can include constant support for the initiatives taken to expand legal base in order to improve the cooperation of courts, prosecutors' offices, and preparing special training courses for law enforcement agencies and civil servants. I look forward to participate on behalf of Minister Professor Zbigniew Rau in this most interesting debate and exchange of experiences. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador, for setting the context. Perhaps the most difficult task for the OSCE is to transform this obvious political will, collective political will, into action. I would like to call the Secretary General of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Mr. Roberto Montella, for his insight.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, President Dimitriou, Minister Kassoulidis. Thank you very much for this conference. I'm honored and pleased to be here in Cyprus. It's my first time. I'm very pleased. This is the first meeting that we have after 2 years of pandemic, the first time that we meet in person. So you're also giving a big gift to the Parliamentary Assembly, the possibility of our members before our annual session to actually meet in person. I wish to express my sincere gratitude to you, Madam President, for hosting us here. Also to Eleni and Mikhailis and an iconic figure in our Parliamentary Assembly, Marina, who have been working for this conference. Thank you very much for the work you've put into this conference. We are here today discussing corruption, and I'm very happy that we're discussing an issue that is different from the issue we have been discussing from the 24th of February throughout. I see here the members of the Diplomatic Corps. You know what I'm talking about. We've been, all our efforts, all our energy has been focused only on discussing the situation on the war in Ukraine. But it's good that we are actually focusing on other issues, which probably have also an impact on what is happening now in Ukraine. And if we are doing this, if we are actually here focusing on discussing on corruption, I think we owe it to one person. And this person has been mentioned by many of you, but I think I cannot refrain by expressing gratitude to Irene Karalambidis. Irene, thank you very much. Some here have mentioned your passion, and we all know about your passion. We've seen you speaking in our meetings when you passionately talk about the fight against corruption, also when you passionately defend the national interest of Cyprus in your back and forth with colleagues from the Turkish delegation. So we know about passion. I will not talk about the obvious. But I think what I would like to underline here is also the work that you've done with your colleagues, with parliamentarians, in pressing on them the importance of fighting corruption. This work has been done maybe not in conferences or in public speeches, but in the corridors, behind the scenes. And it has made a huge impact because you see here we have 60 members from 29 countries, colleagues of yours from the Parliamentary Assembly. And mind, according to my statistics, this is the most attended meeting which is not a statutory meeting, annual session, winter meetings, or an election observation missions. So, of course, it's because after 2 years of COVID, there is an appetite for members of parliament also to engage and also do some activities, but it's also due to your credit, Irene, on trying to really impress on your colleagues the importance. And this is a work that you've done behind the scenes and for which I thank you. But I also like to thank you for another aspect, and this helps me also lead into thanking our colleagues from the international community. And it's been the capacity to find the niche for parliamentarians in this fight against corruption. We are not the leading organization. We have here colleagues from the NOCD, from the OSCE, from ODIHR, Greco, World Bank, Transparency International. I'm sure I've forgotten someone and I apologize already. But your capacity to create a network with those who are the experts in the fight of corruption and trying to say, well, we don't have the monopoly on this fight, but we have to put together all the assets that exist in the international community to fight corruption. This has been extremely clever, and I know this is also thanks to the advice that you get from Marco and my colleagues in Vienna and Ania, and also thank them for the support that they've given to this conference. But I think this is where us, the Parliamentary Assembly, can add value, being aware of who we are or what are our capabilities and work with members of the international community who have the expertise and combine these two together. So I think this is a great contribution that we've done, and for this I thank you very much. So, of course, I have already mentioned our colleagues on the international community. I will not come into too much details on the fight against corruption. I'm not an expert. I'm here to learn from you, and you have already heard from all our guest speakers what is the consequences of corruption, and I'm sure some of you would long to have now a coffee break. But it's been said, corruption is a threat to the very foundations of our societies, and on this I cannot agree more. And also, it also erodes the very principles of the OSCE. The OSCE has been founded and protects democratic institutions, genuine and transparent elections, the respect of human rights, media freedom, respect of national minority rights, and the rule of law. So corruption erodes all of these principles that are very dear to us. And who are the victims at the end of the day, besides our societies? Normally are the citizens. The citizens, what I like to call the end users of the OSCE work, are the victims of corrupt societies. And parliamentarians are those who are the closest to the citizens. You represent, in the OSCE, we like to say we represent 1 billion citizens of the OSCE, of the world. You know, the OSCE stretches from Vancouver to Vladivostok still. So we have still, and I hope it will continue like that, but that's another issue. But we have 1 billion citizens in the OSCE family, and the parliamentarians are their representatives. So as the citizens are the victim of corruptions, it's very important that parliamentarians engage, as Madam President mentioned, bring back the lessons in their national legislation and try to change legislations and try to bring the national legislations very stringent in order to fight the corruptions that erodes the foundations of the societies. So we owe it to our citizens, and I think on that note, I will leave you to enjoy a nice coffee break, but I'm sure the moderator will tell us what is the marching order after this. And I thank you all for this overwhelming participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Montella, for your very distinct perspective. Thank you. This marks the end of the opening session in which all of our speakers have given us their own unique perspective and have set both the tone and the context for the 3 sessions that will follow. If I could kindly ask speakers and members of Parliament to proceed just outside the conference center to the left for a group photo. You may follow the host Parliament staff. This first session, the next session will begin at 11 o'clock sharp and will be moderated by the coordinator of the OSCE Economic and Environmental Activities, Ambassador Igli Hassani. Oh, sorry, yes, of course. We'll make it 11:10 to give ourselves a 10-minute break. Thank you.
And we can start.
I think we are ready to start, and we should all take our seats, please, immediately. Thank you so much.
Dear colleagues, welcome back. This session will focus on the role of national parliaments in preventing and combating corruption. And I'm quite sure we will have a lively discussion, but before we start, let me remind you that those who wish to take the floor at the debate must complete the request the floor card, which is included in the set of documents that you have received in your folders, and hand it to the Secretariat of the hosting parliament, whose desk is right there on the left side of this hall, so that they can prepare a list of speakers. Kindly note that the speakers list will be open during the keynote speeches and will be closed immediately after. Taking the current circumstances into consideration and our focus on anti-corruption and the role of national parliaments, let me stress that the parliamentary oversight over state agencies and structures has never been more current and important than now. For this, let me thank in particular Ms. Irini Haralambidis for her dedication, her vision. We were talking and discussing the organization of this event exactly 3 years ago, back in the summer of 2019. I'm so happy to be here. And I would like to thank also the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Madam President, thank you so much, and absolutely the House of Representatives of the Republic of Cyprus, Ms. Dimitriou, thank you for hosting us here. Corruption flourishes and jeopardizes democracy where the institutions are weak. We will not stop to repeat that corruption represents one of the greatest challenges to security. It undermines the rule of law, reduces state income, and also creates problems on provision for public services. As a result, citizens might turn away from the state, retreat from political processes, migrate, or even stand up against what they perceive to be the corrupt leadership. Corruption also represents a major hindrance to sustainable economic development by reducing investments and impeding economic growth and trade. Our mission in the OSCE is to enhance security and stability. Therefore, my office, the Office of the Coordinator for Economic and Environmental Activities, works on promoting international cooperation on economic issues, strengthening good governance, and assisting our participating states in combating corruption, money laundering, and the financing of terrorism. We work to tackle many aspects of weak governance, including corruption and money laundering, promoting full respect of the rule of law, increase transparency, and develop effective legislation as the foundation of a functioning state. We do this by working closely with government institutions and relevant national structures, as well as regional and international organizations, teaming up with the business community and civil society, and by leveraging our field presences in the Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Today, we're lucky enough to host key experts with different experiences and backgrounds who will provide some concrete examples of best practices in the fight against corruption and which role should national parliaments play in the process. And allow me to give the floor to Ms. Anita Ramasastri, the Special Representative of the Chairperson in Office of the OSCE on combating corruption. Ms. Ramasastri, we're eager to hear about the significant work carried out by the OSCE in this field. The floor is yours for about 12 minutes, and you may deliver your speech from the podium and then take your seat here at the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. As you can tell, I'm out of practice, so forgive me. Good morning to you all. It is really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I will take the liberty, although we are focused on national parliaments as well, to speak to you today about the importance now of the Parliamentary Assembly as well. So I'll speak about both. And thank you so much, Ambassador Hassani, for your moderation this morning. Madam President, President and Vice Presidents of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, good morning. It's my great honor to speak to you today at this important and timely discussion at the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Conference. I give my sincere thanks to the Special Representative from the Parliamentary Assembly on Combating Corruption, Irene Karamlidis, for this invitation. She really is a force to be reckoned with. I am the Special Representative of the Polish Chairperson in Office on Combating Corruption. In this role, I try to serve as an additional champion, not only of the chair's priorities, but also of the excellent work of the OSCE institutions in promoting good governance, public integrity, and preventing corruption in all OSCE participating states. Now, today I won't review all of the many OSCE ministerial declarations or Parliamentary Assembly resolutions on preventing corruption and promoting transparency and good governance. There's so many, and I think many of you know them well. I think we can all agree, and we've heard that this morning, that we can find many shared commitments over the years. So we're all actually beginning. We don't need, or we shouldn't need, a reminder. I will, of course, note that there's a very clear resolution on the role of national parliaments in preventing and combating corruption from the OSCE that was adopted by the Parliamentary Assembly in 2019 in Luxembourg, and that's the most recent commitment. It's very clear, it's very straightforward. It's almost a checklist of all of the commitments, really, that you all need to take forward. Now, the Parliamentary Assembly has a vital role to play in serving as the bridge between OSCE institutions and national parliaments. It can serve as a vibrant engine for innovation. Now, I was pleased to learn as I took on my role that the creation of the coordinator of the Economic and Environmental Coordinator position came out of the deliberations of the Parliamentary Assembly. So again, big ideas can come from this body. So my first message is that we need you to continue to lead by example and to underscore the connection of corruption prevention and good governance in your resolutions and work streams. But my message today is not only about your much-needed leadership role through your work to continue to push corruption prevention, but is to make sure that you do that, as the Polish chair has underscored, across all of your work streams, including in the environmental and economic dimension. So it's not just a resolution on corruption, but corruption prevention should be across all of the resolutions that you undertake. But I'll also say that the role of the Parliamentary Assembly is even more critical in addressing corruption and serving as a voice to the Permanent Council, but as a message bearer back to your national parliaments and legislatures. Now, what has changed? So we've all agreed, the OSCE has a lot of commitments over the years, but what's changed, and we've heard about this, is the context. So let me put it simply, and that's what I'll address for the next few minutes. War, climate, and an energy crisis and a major pandemic create a new reality. So war, climate, and pandemic. Those are the three things I want you to go away with. And I could add food security as a next threat. So with those in mind, let me just share some reflections. First, the nature of the current conflict and its issues of corruption, and again, I'm speaking about the war of aggression, and economic activities should remind participating states of the importance of strong corruption prevention measures as part of conflict prevention. The issues, for example, of beneficial ownership reform and transparency measures have been debated and discussed within the OSCE for years. Again, the issue is action. For many key issues, whether it's contracts awarded during the pandemic, preventing organized crime from securing key energy concessions, or finding assets as part of an asset recovery process underway in your states now, the underpinning key is understanding who truly owns the assets. Passing laws is the beginning. There are needs for effective registries from land to companies, and the OSCE Office of the Coordinator, Ambassador Hassani's team, has a really vital role to play here. They're assisting all of you. But again, as I would say, that the nature of the conflict should make it clear, why do you need to understand who owns assets? You need to as part of a peace and security agenda, but you also need it to deal with these other crises as well. Now, I would note that a related issue, and one that's important to me, is the role of what I call professional enablers. Lawyers, accountants, auditors, and others, the so-called gatekeepers. Too often they are exempted from money laundering regulations and from the consequences, but they are the necessary participants of allowing corruption to flourish. So again, as you think about national laws and national campaigns, please don't forget the advisors and the enablers, as I call them. That's first, the war, and what it underscores about the need for you to act. Second is the climate crisis, and this has been, in the green economy, is a priority for the Polish chair. Now, the need to transition to a green economy is a major factor for all of us. The transition to low carbon is first and foremost about protecting the planet. And as we also know, it's key to energy security and resilient economies. But against this background, as I've noted in my work as a special representative, corruption in the energy sector has been identified by civil society and the media in this region through my discussions as an area of great risk. Wind and solar contracts are awarded to companies with owners who may be engaged in organized crime or fraud, and those who don't have any expertise but are benefiting from fraud and collusion. And I could go on about conflicts of interest in our own national parliaments. So corruption is one of the biggest threats to effective climate action and an obstacle to global transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. After decades of benefiting from the lucrative oil and gas business, fossil fuel companies and governments of producer countries are now hampering efforts to move away from fossil fuels. At the same time, an accelerated rate of energy transition provides a moment for those working in the natural resource governance space to pivot, and that means all of us. Civil society advocates, donors, researchers, government officials need to understand how the expertise, lessons, and tools from dealing with corruption in the extractive sector can be applied to wind and solar energy and other sustainable resources. So I think we all need to turn our attention to the corruption, which is already there, but is only growing in the renewable and clean energy sector. And we need to do it not only because it will help make the transition efficient and effective, but because you now are confronting energy security. As with mining, oil and gas licenses, the awards of renewable energy projects require clear legal procedures to ensure a process that is objective and transparent, deters nepotism and favoritism, and promotes the selection of capable and qualified companies. In large-scale infrastructure projects, the awards of subsidies may result in political influence being exerted in the licensing project. And as I keep saying, beneficial ownership disclosures becoming part of licensing requirements in this sector could be a real important development to limit the influence of politically exposed persons. And in some countries, we already have independent regulatory agencies and investment funds to deal with the green transition. Now, I just came along with Ambassador Hassani from the Environmental and Economic Forum preparatory meeting in Łódź, Poland. Here we discussed important issues of the need for the transition to a clean and green economy. But again, my message there and my message today was that it cannot be green or clean if the underlying deals are dirty. Now, the third thing I want to just address, so I've mentioned war, I've mentioned energy, and now I'll mention the pandemic. At the end of 2021, with the grim state of affairs, we had more than 262 million cases of COVID-19, 5.2 million deaths, and of course now in 2022, that's grown. And we had a challenge with medicine and vaccine distribution. Now, many talk about vaccine equity, national vaccine campaigns that have faltered, and many other issues as the big challenge for why we maybe didn't do as well as we could. But corruption is usually overlooked in these discussions, despite its role in enabling the pandemic to drag on. Now, corruption has co-opted resources and has really weakened health systems as well as damaged public trust. And so some of the types of corruption that have been identified through the pandemic include growing black markets for falsified COVID-19 vaccination and vaccine cards, widespread corruption in procurement and contracting, especially during that states of emergency, data manipulation and lack of transparency in clinical trials relating to new medicines and COVID-19 vaccines, theft and embezzlement from all of our national treasuries of COVID-19 funds and medical equipment, data manipulation related to COVID-19 health data, grand corruption and state capture, which together with slow investigation processes have created a culture of impunity, and then petty corruption, including bribes and profiteering related to healthcare services. So, and again, I'm pleased that we're going to hear from someone from Greco, but at the European level, right, the Council of Europe's Group of States Against Corruption adopted guidelines on how to prevent corruption in the context of the health emergency caused by the pandemic. The guidelines underline that the COVID-19 outbreak increased corruption risks with the health sector being specifically exposed, in particular because of surges in the immediate need for medical supplies and the simplification of procurement rules, overcrowded medical facilities, and overburdened medical staff. While acknowledging that corrupt practices may differently affect the public or the private sectors, including but not limited to the procurement system, the guidelines identify bribery in medical services, corruption in new product research and development, and COVID-19 specific fraud related to the marketing of counterfeit products as kind of typologies of corruption. And Greco stresses that transparency in the public sector is the key means of preventing corruption. So what does that mean for the OSCE and the Parliamentary Assembly? Well, it's that in order for us to tackle corruption and good practice in the delivery of health care, and to focus on implementation of key recommendations from our partners, such as Greco and other institutions, we just need to take those commitments and basically dovetail them with the commitments that you've already made. And you'll see that some are specific to the pandemic. So the Parliamentary Assembly and your parliaments have a role to say, what are the new and specific things we need to do in our policymaking related to the healthcare sector or related to the green energy sector? But my main message as I conclude is that if you look further, most of the things that you need to do are about core conflict of interest and lobbying reforms, core transparency measures around things like beneficial ownership, and then basically core procurement reform. So the recipe, while the challenges are big and different, always ends up being the same. And you're going to hear on the second panel today, again, from experts that will speak about those issues. So this is about legislative reform, but good practices, which can be implemented across the board, but are key in healthcare and energy sectors in particular. So in a recent report from the Parliamentary Assembly Committee on Economic Affairs, Science, and Technology, it itself, or you, I should say, your members have acknowledged that particularly in times of crisis, fighting corruption should remain a top priority across the OSCE region, as it represents a major security threat that reverberates across international borders directly impacting states' developmental opportunities and citizens' lives. And therefore, you've stated that coordinated responses at national and international levels are needed to prevent and combat the globalized system of corruption. So your role in both recognizing the connection of the second dimension and corruption prevention to addressing the challenges I have outlined is vital, right? That's my key message back, is right, you've already recognized this, but now war, pandemic, energy security means that you need to act. So please think about this when you debate corruption and good governance as a topic. And I want you to think about it and just remember that when you debate any of these other issues, that corruption should be present as part of your policymaking solutions, not just in specialized and tailored debate on corruption. But more importantly, please continue to work with OCEA, so the Office of the Coordinator of Economic and Environmental Activities, with ODIHR and other partner institutions to bring these agendas home nationally. The last mile, this is very important. Before, the cost of corruption were already large and already harmful, but now we have seen the cost as producing war and making it hard to secure peace because of the fact that we don't know where assets are, energy instability, and in the case of pandemic, needless death. So I, as a representative of the Polish chair, stand ready to work with you on behalf of the chair to help reinforce your national priorities and to serve as a technical expert to help shape much needed action in all of our states. So I hope that during the course of this conference, on the margins, we can have those discussions because my role is to help support your efforts and to bring them home in that last mile. Thank you so much, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ramasastri, for the abundance of information that you have injected in the debate, as well as for your determination to carry forward the anti-corruption agenda. As has been already stressed, international organizations are significant structural pillars of the fight against corruption. In this regard, we are very glad to be able to benefit from the experience of the Council of Europe's Group of States Against Corruption, best known by the acronym GRECO. The executive director, Ms. Hani Juncker, has been, and her organization has been a leader in setting standards internationally on fighting corruption. Its methodology as an anti-corruption monitoring body and its expertise in the field is world renewed. We're very much awaiting your input to our discussion. Unfortunately, we have to stick to the 12 minutes rule, but thank you for being with us, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Good morning, everybody, Excellencies, colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you in this important event. A special thank you to Irene Karambalabidis for her relentless commitment, and thank you to our hosts, the House of Representatives of Cyprus, for their kind welcome. As we have heard, corruption is a serious threat to the rule of law and human rights, and perhaps no issue does more to undermine the trust of the public in our institutions and to alienate citizens from democratic processes. Corruption should be fought wherever it happens, whoever it implicates, and of course national parliaments have a key role to play in that. I will speak about three main things this morning, a few words about what GRECO is, then some of the components that can help prevent public sector corruption and where parliaments can provide support, and then what parliaments can do to fight and prevent corruption in their own houses, if you like. Briefly, by way of background, GRECO is a body set up to monitor member states' compliance with the Council of Europe's anti-corruption standards, which include several conventions, criminal law and civil law conventions on corruption. GRECO is open to all countries. We have 48 member states, the member states of the Council of Europe, plus the US and Kazakhstan. The OSCE ODIHR is an observer with GRECO, and so are the UNODC, the OECD, and the EU. And GRECO's monitoring is based on on-site visits organized by thematic round, and we do baseline evaluations. And then after that, we do a compliance process where we assess how and whether the member states have actually complied with the original recommendations. We are currently in the 5th thematic round, which deals with corruption in central government, so persons with top executive functions and law enforcement agencies. But a number of our member states are also still subject to the compliance procedure in the 4th round, which deals with parliamentarians, judges, and prosecutors. Greco has gained a lot of experience on how best to fight and prevent corruption across our member states and covering the very diverse groups that I just mentioned. Each group has, of course, its own specificities, and our recommendations reflect that. But the building blocks in fighting corruption tend to be quite universal. So I'd like to mention just a few of them, starting with judicial independence, which is absolutely crucial and must exist without any qualification. And in parallel with that, specialized anti-corruption bodies, which exist in a large number of member states, should have the independence necessary for their function and their ability to fulfill their mandates. Secondly, transparency and access to information are key. I know you will have a separate panel on that later on, but I want to say that making available information, as we heard already, it's the first step towards transparency, and it's also the first steps towards reducing the risk of impunity. Also, the prevention and management of conflicts of interest is necessary to ensure that institutions serve public and not private interests. This is one of the main purposes of declarations of assets and interests and of codes of conduct, and especially codes of conduct is something where Greco has issued a lot of recommendations to member states. Even the best rules will remain on paper if they are not accompanied by effective supervision and enforcement mechanisms, and breaches of the rules should come with consequences, and the consequences should be proportionate to the seriousness of the breach. I also want to mention whistleblowing, which can be very, very important in revealing mismanagement in the public and private sectors and cases of inappropriate lobbying. And the channels for whistleblowing should be effective and they should be known. All of this should be accompanied by a clear commitment to preventing and fighting corruption, starting from the top, preferably in the form of a national anti-corruption strategy that is implemented and which includes anti-corruption policies at the level of each institution. Really, all public bodies should relay a message of zero tolerance, and managers have to lead by example to ensure that there is a culture of integrity which takes root and permeates the entire system. This is also the case when it comes to national parliaments and their own integrity frameworks. So far I've spoken about public sector corruption as such, but the legislature, which you represent, will be seen as a model by others, and its approach will be key to earning and maintaining public trust in the rule of law and in institutions. In our work under our fourth round, Greco has set out what national parliaments can do in respect of their own integrity. And Greco looked, for example, at the transparency and inclusiveness of the legislative process, and it found that in most member states, the rules were satisfactory, but they were not always respected in practice. Some of the problematic practices observed by Greco were, for instance, the lack of or late publication of amendments to legal text and deadlines that did not enable a meaningful discussion and public participation. Codes of ethics for members of parliament exist in most member states, which is very good, but lobbying remains a very thorny issue. Greco has invited states to establish detailed rules on how parliamentarians engage in contact with lobbyists and other third parties that seek to influence the legislative activities. Of course, everyone has the right to participate in public affairs, and lobbying is fundamentally a legitimate activity. It can make a real contribution to well-informed public decision-making. What it's about is transparency. The public should be able to gain access to information about who is influencing political decision-making and in what ways. The purpose of declarations of assets and interests, including in respect of close family, is to spot possible conflicts of interest and manage them before they materialize. Transferring assets to close family members to shield them from scrutiny is not unheard of as a practice, but Greco found that only a minority of member states actually request declarations from MPs as close family. And also ad hoc conflicts of interest that arise in the connection with specific debates and processes should be declared as well. And also, since no rules can capture the variety and complexity of real life, giving MPs access to an integrity advisor for confidential discussion of their ethical dilemmas can be a very good step. The body in charge of supervising respect for all these rules should be as independent as possible and should be empowered to investigate possible breaches of the Code of Conduct or other integrity rules. And this has often been the most difficult part in practice, actually, what to do when there is actual misconduct. You are all involved in the work of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I can just say that Greco was called on to provide guidance to PACE, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, back in 2017. This was following accusations of misconduct and corrupt behavior by some members of that assembly. Greco issued a list of recommendations, and since then, PACE has taken a number of specific steps to improve the ethical framework for its members, and that includes a code of conduct, which we heard about earlier from President Cederholm. Just a few final comments before I close. I want to say that Greco appreciates very much the high level of engagement by our member states in our evaluation and compliance reports. Without that, we would not be able to obtain any results. But even so, we do see that implementation of Greco's recommendations can be strengthened further. It's important that the formal support for eradicating corruption is also translated into concrete improvements. And anything that national parliaments can do to facilitate that is highly appreciated. We're very pleased to see a trend where corruption is not perceived in isolation. It's really understood as being a truly transversal issue, which also means that the response has to be multifaceted. The more we can raise the issue of the cost and negative implications of corruption for people's lives, the better. We don't underestimate how difficult it can be to develop and maintain a culture of integrity and zero tolerance towards corruption, but really it is indispensable for our democracies and for the credibility of our institutions, and therefore our work continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Juncker, for such a substantive contribution to our discussion and for sharing your suggestions on how national parliaments can set the right conditions for preventing and fighting corruption and for overcoming well-known obstacles towards developing a culture of integrity. Now, may I give the screen to Ms. Brigitte Strobelshaw, who is the Chief of the Corruption and Economic Crime Branch of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Ms. Strobelshaw, the UNCAC, the United Convention Against Corruption, is the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument, which is undoubtedly a significant achievement. Through country visits and review of implementation of relevant commitments, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is trying to further broaden and strengthen the anti-corruption agenda. We're very eager to hear your presentation, and you have the screen for 12 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning and greetings to everybody from Vienna. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, it's a pleasure for UNODC to participate in this international conference, and my words of gratitude first and foremost are for the organizers and hosts, the House of Representatives of the Republic of Cyprus and the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, also for facilitating my last-minute change virtual participation due to me not being able to travel due to COVID. I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this important and topical session on the role of national parliaments in preventing and addressing corruption. Corruption plagues every society and is at the heart of many of the world's most pressing issues. We heard from previous speakers, it erodes public trust in government, undermines the rule of law, and gives rise to political and economic grievances that can fuel violence and instability. Hence, preventing and fighting corruption is a key enabler to achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. UNODC is the guardian of the UN Convention Against Corruption and the secretariat to its Conference of the States Parties. The Convention is the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument. It sets universally agreed standards for corruption prevention, criminalization, law enforcement, international cooperation, and asset recovery. Since its entry into force on 14 December 2005, the parties to the Convention have grown to 189, a clear testament to the world's prioritization of the fight against corruption. Its implementation is supported through a global peer review process, the Implementation Review Mechanism, which is built on the pre-existing models of the Council of Europe's GRECO, which we just heard from Hanne Juncker, the Executive Secretary, and the OECD's Working Group on Bribery. The information collected through the country reviews on the measures taken to implement the Convention continues to shed light on good practices developed as well as difficulties and challenges. This allows for the exchange of knowledge and experience so that states parties can learn from one another or provide assistance necessary to fill implementation gaps. Under the current second cycle of the review mechanism, which is looking at the chapters on asset recovery and prevention, for instance, 16% of all needs and gaps identified through the reviews were related to legislative gaps. This demonstrates that more still needs to be done to bring national legislation in line with international obligations. National parliaments and legislative bodies have a central role to play here by promoting adherence to the Convention, enacting legislative measures necessary to fulfill the implementation, and to follow up on the recommendations stemming from the country reviews. This role was also recognized by the General Assembly. In June 2021, the General Assembly held its first ever special session against corruption. Member states adopted by consensus a high-level political declaration which recognized, among other issues, the vital role of national parliaments and legislative bodies in adopting and monitoring the policies and practices intended to contribute to the implementation of the Convention. It also emphasized the need to promote the role of parliaments and other legislative bodies in the management of public finances and to ensure their capacity to exercise effective budget oversight. The need to strengthen relations between national legislators, supreme audit institutions, and other oversight bodies was further highlighted. The emphasis placed by the General Assembly on this topic is not coincidental. Last year's annual parliamentary hearing, jointly organized by the Interparliamentary Union and the United Nations in February 2021, was entitled Fighting Corruption to Restore Trust in Government and Improve Development Prospects. The hearing provided a timely opportunity for members of parliaments to make contributions to the political declaration, which was then later adopted by the General Assembly in June. Earlier on in 2019, the Conference of the States Parties to the Convention had reiterated the importance of the role that national parliaments and other legislative bodies play in the fight against corruption by adopting a resolution entitled Promoting Good Practices in relation to the role of national parliaments and other legislative bodies in preventing and combating corruption in all its forms. Interesting, this is the same year, as we just heard from Ms. Ramasastri, the OSCE adopted its key resolution on the role of parliaments. As a follow-up to that resolution, the role of parliaments in the fight against corruption was considered by the Working Group on the Prevention of Corruption, a subsidiary body of the Conference of the States Parties, in June of 2021. In preparation for that meeting, UNODC generated a report on experiences, good practices, and challenges in promoting the role of national parliaments to prevent and combat corruption. The report's based on information provided by 39 states parties, including several OSCE participating states, in response to a questionnaire. While the full report's available online, I would like to highlight some key findings. States parties stressed the core legislative and oversight functions of parliaments and legislative bodies, such as the adoption of legislation to criminalize acts of corruption or facilitate the recovery of stolen assets, and the oversight of government's management of public finances. In addition to these core functions, states parties also reported on other important initiatives driven by their national parliaments to promote integrity of elected public officials. For instance, several countries, including OSCE participating states, reported that they had adopted codes of conduct or monitoring mechanisms to enhance the integrity of elected public officials, emphasizing the need to uphold basic ethical principles, rules, and standards of conduct. States parties also noted that codes of conduct for members of parliament provided for the prevention of conflicts of interest, for the prohibition of corruption, and the acceptance of gifts. Some states parties reported on open parliaments and similar initiatives designed to promote transparency and civil society participation in decision-making processes. For example, one method identified to increase transparency was the broadcasting of parliamentary activities through designated television channels or other streaming services. In some instances, these channels aired civic programs to inform and educate civil society about political life. The importance of engaging in interparliamentary dialogue and cooperation was another key area underlined by national parliaments of many states parties. Platforms provided by interparliamentary assemblies and organizations, such as this very conference, were considered key to the exchange of good practices and information. UNODC continues to support national parliaments in the performance of their core legislative and oversight functions. This is done both through existing partnerships, such as the partnership with the Interparliamentary Union or the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, as well as through engagement with other international, regional, and national parliamentary assemblies and organizations in support of their efforts to prevent and combat corruption. UNODC also recognizes the importance of engaging young parliamentarians and strengthen anti-corruption education to promote the effective implementation of the Convention. Under our new anti-corruption education initiative, the Global Resource for Anti-Corruption Education and Youth Empowerment, or GRACE initiative, we are developing activities to increase awareness of and commitment to acting with integrity among parliamentarians, with a keen focus on young parliamentarians. Against this background, this conference is another key step towards greater contributions by parliamentary assemblies to the fight against corruption and greater interparliamentary cooperation. You can continue to count on the support of UNODC, and I wish you a successful conference, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Strobel-Shaw. There was a round of applause for your contribution and your very informative approach to the discussion today. And our next speaker is the OSCE's Parliamentary Assembly Vice President and Special Representative on Combating Corruption, Ms. Irini Haralambidis, whom I shouldn't introduce. Her reputation precedes her in all these aspects. Ms. Haralambidis, you have the famous 12 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank all previous speakers, Mrs. Anita Ramasastri, Mrs. Junger, and Mrs. Strobel-Shaw, for their interventions, their comments, and for sharing their precious knowledge with us. Dear colleagues, corruption is more than a threat to democracy. It is more than an ethical issue. Citizens bear heavy economic and social costs due to corrupt practices. Being a member of parliament myself, I place particular focus on the responsibilities of parliaments in fighting corruption. In our democracies, our fellow citizens look to their parliamentarians, to the people they have trusted and they have elected to set the framework of law and oversee its implementation. National parliaments are expected to play a leading role in combating corruption, and national parliaments are very well equipped for this battle. Their core legislative oversight and representation functions are powerful tools. National parliaments must use their legislative function to fight corruption. Enactment of more robust legislation to exclude conflicts of interest lie in the hands of parliaments. Legislation protecting whistleblowers is in the hand of parliaments. I submitted a relevant legislative proposal in 2016, which was enacted into law this year. I am glad to say that it was adopted unanimously. Furthermore, the role of parliamentarians is essential for the adoption of laws on lobbying, on shell companies, on ultimate beneficial ownership, and on asset recovery. Specifically, on the issue of ultimate beneficial ownership, our dear colleagues in Slovakia can be very proud for their comprehensive legislation on this important matter. I had the chance to participate in a conference in Bratislava on the issue, and I was fully informed about that important legislation. What I consider most essential is for such legislation to be strict, leaving no margin for exploitation from those that wish to evade it. Moreover, lawmaking by Parliament is required to guarantee the independence of the judiciary, to shield audit institutions from external influences, and to make sure that anti-corruption agencies are not hollow constructs. The media play an important role in defending democracy. It is our obligation to guarantee freedom of the media and to secure the broader possible space for civil society. Holding politicians accountable is also a huge media responsibility. A distinct capability of parliaments is their role in the national budget cycle. Although their involvement in drafting budget legislation and in its implementation and audit varies to a significant extent across the OSCE area, one way or another, national parliaments can have ultimate control over public finances. And this can be one of the most powerful parliamentarian tools for holding governments to account. At the same time, the adoption of budgets for independent institutions has its own distinct significance. Supreme audit institutions must be further strengthened and provided with all the necessary tools and powers in order to effectively exercise their part in the system of checks and balances, and their budgets must enable them to match resources and responsibilities. Besides their legislative function, national parliaments must also use their oversight function to combat corruption. Holding governments accountable is a core responsibility for parliaments. I strongly believe that political parties in parliament, pro-government, or in the opposition need to be able to find some common ground in exercising parliamentary oversight, this being one of the cornerstones of democracy. And this must be taken into consideration in the allocation of the chairpersonships of parliamentary committees. For instance, parliamentary expenditure control committees must be chaired by the opposition so that curbing corruption cannot fall victim to party politics. Another core element of parliamentary oversight is the review and approval of certain public officials' appointments. Relevant practices vary considerably across the OSCE region and are subjected to strict constitutional limitations in some countries. Presidential democracies may be presented with more challenges than parliamentary democracies, but this should not pose permanent obstacles. A prejudiced appointment of officials can really make or break the work of such institutions. Effective participation of national parliaments in this process is an indispensable precondition. National parliaments must fight for their right to be consulted upon concerning appointments, particularly of officials in supreme audit institutions and anti-corruption commissions. Additionally, cooperation with the aforementioned independent institutions is central. These institutions have the resources, expertise, and mandate to look deep and wide into matters pertaining to the use of public funds. To be effective, they must be able to report the results of their work to specialized parliamentary committees and to make recommendations to Parliament for enactment of legislation that responds to their findings. Parliaments must also be able to exercise oversight on whether other competent authorities, such as the public prosecutor, prompts investigations or takes necessary action based on findings of the supreme audit institutions. This is the essence of the effective functioning of checks and balances. In our efforts to curb corruption, independent and attentive media can support parliamentary oversight efforts to a great extent. The media can bring scandals to the forefront following their own research. The Pandora Papers, the Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, Finchen Files, and the golden passports in Cyprus were brought up by the media. The media can follow up on investigations launched on corrupt officials. They have to follow up on corrective action taken every time a scandal surfaces. On the other hand, corruption is not only about politicians, but in some cases, it is also about the media, when they choose to silence or bury scandals, or they fail to follow up a scandal. Dear colleagues, politicians must also use their representation function to combat corruption. Consensus building within our societies, as well as the encouragement of citizens' active engagement on matters of public interest, such as corruption, is instrumental in enhancing integrity. Strengthening the participation of civil society empowers citizens to reject corrupt practices and to expose corrupt politicians and officials. Parliaments can help to channel the interests and concerns of civil society into parliamentary debates. Furthermore, broad coalitions between Parliament and a vibrant civil society can be helpful in curbing corruption. They might be effective by creating synergies through pooling resources and increasing the flow of information. What members of Parliament know best is how to mobilize citizens. We can amplify the voices of our citizens and our civil society using our established outreach channels, and we can create the necessary awareness and determination to fight corruption. Dear colleagues, in order for national parliaments to be able to exercise their role in preventing corruption, they need also to self-regulate effectively and credibly. And I think Mrs. Juncker will agree to that. If parliaments themselves are dominated by corrupt individuals, they risk their legitimacy as representatives of the people. We have had our own negative experience in this regard, the Cyprus Parliament, as exposed by the Al Jazeera News Network. It is important that national parliaments put their own houses in order first. Even within the most robust and coherent legislative framework, very little can be achieved by legislators if they do not first confront the specter of corruption within their own ranks. Therefore, political party and political campaign financing, as well as codes of conduct for parliamentarians, are a litmus test. The Cyprus House of Representatives have adopted its own code of conduct. Self-regulation is not an easy process, trust me, especially when it comes to matters of conflict of interest. Laws regulating campaign finances, including regulations on the disclosure of interests, spending and contribution limits, and the provision of public subsidies, have acquired increased significance. Furthermore, parliamentarians themselves must adhere to codes of conduct or other legislative equivalents which provide guidance for matters ranging from conflicts of interest and the disclosure of assets to post-governmental employment and nepotism. To be effective, such codes must be accompanied by enforcement mechanisms and be based on a shared understanding by parliamentarians of what is appropriate behavior and what is not, because otherwise they amount to empty promises. Proper codes of conduct shield against corrupt practices, but also, and perhaps most importantly, they help to restore the often shattered public confidence in parliamentarians, in politicians. We often say that no country is immune to corruption, nor international organizations, I might add. In this regard, as the Special Representative on Fighting Corruption, I have prepared a supplementary item on a code of conduct for the upcoming OSCE Parliamentary Assembly annual session in Birmingham, which has already been sent to delegations. This is not, might say, a final proposal for a code of conduct, but rather a starting point aimed at laying down some basic provisions that we can discuss further after the annual session. The supplementary item has been drafted after consulting with International Secretariat, and I thank them very much for the insight they have provided. It aims at sending a strong message that OSCPA is committed to combating corruption and that it can lead by example in this field. I very much hope that it will be validated and adopted by our Assembly unanimously so that we can continue to work in that direction. In concluding, I wish to stress once again that corruption does not stop at national borders. Links across borders are common. Parliamentary cooperation at a regional or global level, like the one promoted by our Assembly, can be a very valuable tool to this end. It allows the strengthening of advocacy efforts and the sharing of experiences and best practices. Strong peer review must also peer support emerge from interparliamentary cooperation. I very much believe in the strength of the OSCPA in this field. I know for a fact that by maintaining continuity in our anti-corruption priorities, a strong focus, a committed leadership, we can significantly benefit members of national parliaments. Good practices need not only to be discussed. The OSCPA must be able to develop its own sets of recommended rules for its members, which incorporate good practices that we can utilize. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ms. Harlambilis, for your contribution. Indeed, political will is the key in fighting corruption. Dear colleagues, the speakers list is now closed. We're ready to open the floor for the debate. The Secretariat has informed me about quite significant number of requests for the floor. We have 11 registered requests. I will have to set the speaking time to 3 minutes per participant, so we will be able to manage our time. And may I ask you all to respect the time limit. When you're given the floor, I am told, please open the cover of the microphone and press the button. I know you know these things. The first speaker on my list is Mr. Slava Radunovic from Montenegro, followed by Mr. Sargis Kandanyan of Armenia. Mr. Radunovic, please.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, I would like to underline the importance of this conference, as well as to express my gratitude to our host, Cypriot House of Representatives, for this extraordinary organization. Without a doubt, corruption is a form of crime, but a very specific one. Only recently, it has ceased to be a domestic issue of a state or society and has been transformed to the phenomena seeking for international attention. It has far-reaching negative consequences for the economy and leads to severe consequences in terms of the economic growth and development, being at the same time a symbol of the weakness of economic, social, and political institutions. In a society with favorable conditions for corruption, the Parliament's exposure to it is even higher. Therefore, the Parliaments must demonstrate their increased readiness to fight this phenomena by using the instruments of their disposal. One of the main roles of the Parliament is to promote zero tolerance for corruption, whereby a strong Parliament is the foundation for addressing this issue. It is very important that we, as parliamentarians, learn from each other and exchange experience in the field of fighting corruption, and in this sense, we must admit that political will is certainly the necessary basis for taking any action in combating corruption. Political will must not be merely declarative. Political will exists in the societies and in the parliaments, where it is constantly demonstrated through activities that prove its existence. When it comes to the instruments available to parliaments for fighting corruption, here we should underscore their legislative function, the control mechanism, strong cooperation with civil society, and surely cooperation at the interparliamentary level. Therefore, the anti-corruption struggle of the Parliament through its legislative function consists in passing better laws as in legislative activity that contributes to the greatest possible contribution to improving the public administration environment and transparency and accountability of the government sector from the aspect of fighting all forms of corruption. The Parliament of Montenegro has ratified the following conventions: the Civil Law Convention on Corruption and the Criminal Law Convention on Corruption, and in 2008 it adopted the resolution on the fight against corruption and organized crime. Also in 2014, the Parliament of Montenegro passed the law on prevention of corruption, which came into force on January 1st, 2016. In accordance with this law, the Agency for the Prevention of Corruption was established, which unfortunately, although with a very promising name, does more harm than good in fighting against corrupt politicians. Namely, it serves as a register of reported property and does not deal with undeclared property at all, which is a major issue. Thus, a politician who, for example, has forgotten to report his wife's extraordinary income of 200 euros is often the subject of media attention, while on the other side, the agency does not deal with the one who hides tens of millions acquired through corruption. If they did, it would be very easily eradicated with corruption if it would be if law alone are enough for fight effectively. So I would conclude that it is very important that we not just do anything to pass the law, but also we must do everything for a good implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. I will continue with Mr. Kandanyan of Armenia, to be followed by Mr. Theodoros Karaoglu.
Thank you. I would also like to thank the House of Representatives of Cyprus for organizing this conference and our speakers for their remarks. As Ms. Sharalambides mentioned in her opening remark, this is a platform to share good practices. And I would like to talk about Armenia's story of combating corruption during the past few years. After the 2018 Velvet Revolution in Armenia, the fight against corruption has been one of the key priorities of the new government within the democratic and security reforms agenda of the country. The parliaments elected after snap parliamentary elections in 2018 and 2021, of course, have played an important role creating the institutional framework and necessary legislation for the policies to combat corruption. The success of our policies is expressed in the most recent Corruption Perception Index report published by Transparency International. The report notes Armenia is a success story of the Corruption Perception Index in the last 5 years, improving 14 points since 2017. Mass protests in 2018 forced out an entrenched political elite in favor of reform-minded government. Armenia has since expanded civil liberties, paving the way for more sustainable civic engagement and accountability. End of citation. I would like to elaborate on what has made this assessment possible on the institutional and policy-making level. First, the National Security Strategy of Armenia, adopted in 2020, clearly identifies corruption as a national security threat. Second, the Armenian government adopted the anti-corruption strategy of Armenia in 2019. It has 3 general directions: prevention of corruption, counteraction of corruption, and raising public awareness. As a significant step in direction of prevention of corruption, the Commission to Prevent Corruption was created in 2019. This is an independent body, the commissioners of which are elected by the parliament, but the candidates for commissioners undergo a very competitive competition procedure. Quite a wide range of public officials and their relatives submit a detailed annual declaration about their income and property, and from this year also about their expenses. Also political parties submit their declarations. The Commission to Prevent Corruption also checks the integrity of the candidates for judges and justices. Within the scope of counteraction of corruption, new institutions were created. The Anti-Corruption Committee was established. This is an investigative body, the head of the investigators of which are selected through competition, who also undergo integrity check procedure. The Anti-Corruption Court was created, and soon we will have judges specialized in corruption-related cases. A new anti-corruption division in the prosecutor's office was created, the prosecutors of which and their candidates undergo in their integrity check and are selected through competition. Hence, Armenia has already created a full chain of institutions that examine and fight against corruption, from investigation to court rulings. And this gives us confidence that with these institutional capacities and the political will, we will become more successful in combating corruption in upcoming years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will continue with Mr. Theodoros Karaoglu of Greece, to be followed by Mr. Mitev of Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honorable colleagues, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. The proceedings of OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in Cyprus are taking place under crucial circumstances. The Russian invasion in Ukraine forms day-to-day new data with regard to geopolitical matters. The destabilization of balances, the changes of allies, the reclassification in global level cause a series of reactions which may put in danger acquis of decades. We have an obligation to be present at this call of responsibility. We must not give space and time to the forces of arbitrary acts and of revisionism to enforce their own agenda. In the light of those considerations, national parliamentaries are the guards of the democracy. They are the expression of free will of the citizens, the fort against any attempt of totalitarianism. Having said that, we have a responsibility to take into serious consideration the fact that in a global level, people are overtaken by a feeling of uncertainty. This is a sad side of the reality, which highlights the need to reinforce democracy. In order to achieve this kind of reinforcement, we have to combat corruption. Corruption is a direct threat to every country's rule of law, human rights, democracy itself. It is an international pathogen that exists everywhere and takes action against administration, healthy competition in economy, commitment to merit, the society we live in. It should be our main priority to face every act that puts in danger the stability of all democratic institutions, ethical principles of our society. Honorable colleagues, we need to take action before mankind loses its trust to law and transparency. Reinforcing democracy means combating corruption. To achieve that, we need patience and persistence. We know that when citizens lose their trust to the rule of law, populism is taking action, and through populism arise forces that try to take control of all decision-making power. In the last 3 years in Greece, we are determined to combat corruption. For this reason, we have taken coordinated actions, and we use every institutional structure to isolate situations like this. The report of the Transparency International, published just last January, shows the results. My country, Greece, during 2021, climbed into its best position in the last decade. It is in the 58th place among 180 countries. The official report of the Transparency International includes Greece among the countries globally which have made the greatest progress. It is reported that we have managed to seize the benefits of the reforms against corruption. At this point, the national parliamentaries need to take action by signing a new social contract of principles and values which will further improve the quality of our democracy. If we want to be realistic and honest to ourselves, a society without merit and positive competition is not a real democracy. We need institutional changes in the mechanism of control in order to achieve the right and fair function of justice. These are considered vital in order for politics to attract honorable, capable, and moral people to serve public life. With these thoughts, I'm certain that the works of the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE will be fruitful and successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will continue with Mr. Iskren Mitev of Bulgaria, to be followed by Ms. Pia Kauma of Finland. Please, ladies and gentlemen, let's stick to the 3 minutes for the benefit of this discussion. Mr. Mitev, please.
Thank you. Dear Madam President, Your Excellencies, and distinguished delegates. I want to start with a quote from Joe Biden. Corruption is a cancer that eats away of a citizen's faith in democracy, diminishes the instincts for innovation and creativity. Corruption is the biggest reason for the downfall of most great empires and civilizations. Thank you, Irene Harawam-Bires, for bringing us to this beautiful heart, for the beating heart of this ancient island that remembers the rise and fall of so many empires, to remind us that if we do not take actions to fight this cancer, it will pollute our hearts, minds, and eventually destroy our democracies. Only 6 months ago, I was about to immigrate from Bulgaria because I refused to live in a corruption. Only 6 months ago, I blamed our former political leaders for being the source of that corruption, and only 6 months ago, I was wrong. Corruption is something you should not blame to anybody. Corruption is a systematic problem, a state of mind, and you should change it. Corruption is a driver that wants to avoid a fine, ready to pay money for a cop that has such a low salary that they cannot afford their living. Corruption is a patient that is worried that their overworked and underpaid doctor will take better care for a small gift. Corruption is a businessman scared that politicians will stop him to make their business. Corruption is a reporter afraid that they will lose their job if they show a different perspective. Corruption is a systematic problem, so we should rebuild the systems and the environment and not blame it on the people. Take action, responsibility, and act for a change. How do we act in Bulgaria? The ruling coalition in Bulgaria, led by the Prime Minister Kirill Petkov, provided our Prosecutor General with a long list of names and specific cases associated with the corruption in Bulgaria, and we are waiting for the results. The specialist court and prosecution were abolished as they were suspected to be part of a that they were under political influence in the past. An investigation was in construction of one of the main highways in Bulgaria with the signals for a huge, over 3 million euros of advance payments to under-registered companies. Active measures have been taken for the investigation of the report in the Public Financial Agency, according to which Bulgaria has lost over 270 million euros in the period for the 5 years due to corruption with the State Commission of Gambling. The restriction of the public administration exercise of one of the main border control checkpoints has already begun, and this is one of the main points of corruption in Bulgaria. And to conclude, I'll conclude with a quote. There are still those of us who work to overcome corruption and believe it to be possible. I conclude with that quote from the fictional brave female leader from the Good Force, Padme Amidala from Star Wars. Because fighting corruption is still a fiction for many of us, I really hope that this conference is an important step to turning this fiction into reality. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Ms. Pia Kauma from Finland, to be followed by Mr. Igor Yanushev of North Macedonia.
Dear Mr. President, I would like to start by commending the Cyprus delegation and Parliament, and in particular Irene Salarambides, for convening this conference and for having chosen our topic. Corruption is not a new phenomenon. Since antiquity, corruption has been widespread. Today, it is seen as a major threat both in the private and the public sphere. The positive thing is that today we speak more openly about corruption in its various forms, but the difficulty is how to bring about sustainable change. Corruption takes various forms in different societies. Therefore, there can be no one way of combating evil and preventing this phenomenon. The approach must be multidisciplinary, and it must be endorsed at the highest political level. I would like to comment two different approaches to the problem. First of all, high-level, large-scale, deep-rooted corruption. Often this form of corruption is present in countries with authoritarian rule and where the democratic institutions are weak. Consequently, it undermines even further trust in democratic institutions and procedures. It is a threat to democracy that needs to be tackled from various angles. Firstly, as parliamentarians and legislators, we should make sure that our national legislation is in line with international standards and norms. Many international norms and standards have been set, but we need to monitor more effectively the compliance of these standards, and we need to strengthen the capacity building in individual countries and regions. We also need to deal with the criminalization of corruption in the public and private sectors, liability and compensation for damage caused by corruption, conduct of public officials, and the financing of political parties. My second point is about protecting and supporting whistleblowers. In many countries where corruption is widespread, we have seen large popular movements of protest. Groups and courageous individuals have revealed corruptive practices and identified individuals. Many of these whistleblowers have been imprisoned or forced to leave their countries. Some have been even murdered. These are individuals who need our support and protection, but it also requires that we maintain and defend the freedom of the media and the safety of journalists. Dear colleagues, then I would like to say a few words about the more light or more subtle version of corruptive behavior, because corruption can also be more subtle. Positions of trust which are deserved for friends and like-minded people. Small sums of money or gifts of different kinds changing hands in exchange for small or large-scale services provided by public authorities. This is the type of corruption that increases inequality in society. We need to understand that it is important to tackle all signs of corruption, however negligible they may seem. Maintaining a social welfare system with services to all citizens in the field of health and social welfare and education is a costly enterprise. Nobody wants to pay taxes, but everybody wants to enjoy free or low-cost services. A general welfare state should prevent underclasses developing in society. A welfare system can be maintained only with a well-functioning and transparent tax system, and only bearing in mind that the compensation level, like salaries of public servants, is at the level that is high enough for them so that they don't have to resort to corruption in order for them to pay for rent, food, and other necessities. Dear colleagues, the OSCE has traditionally many tools in its toolbox. One of them is the confidence-building measures. I believe that combating corruption is in fact an important confidence-building measure in both the short and long-term perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll pass the floor to Mr. Igor Yanushev of North Macedonia, to be followed by Mr. Omar Terbak of Algeria. Mr. Yanushev, please.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me at the beginning to thank our colleagues from the Cyprus delegation for the successful organization of the conference, which I believe will contribute to raising awareness of the need and urgency for an effective fight against corruption at all levels, including in national parliaments. Corruption hampers democratic processes, slows down development, weakens the rule of the law, and undermines stability, thus affecting all layers of the society. On the other hand, lack of transparency and widespread perception of corruption in public offices reduce citizens' trust in democratic institutions and processes. The OSCE, with its intergovernmental and interparliamentary dimension, is ideally positioned to support the participant states in preventing and fighting corruption. Dear colleagues, national parliaments have a vital role to play in preventing corruption by enacting and effective legislation and exercising parliamentary oversight and control over the government and other holders of public offices. The fight against corruption, above all, involves building a comprehensive anti-corruption legal and institutional framework harmonized with international standards. And more importantly, it is a full implementation in the system. The Macedonian Parliament has adopted key laws in this area, and the latest Greco report says that the current criminalization of the corruption offenses largely meet the requirements of the Criminal Law Convention on Corruption of the Council of Europe. Nevertheless, in this period of couple of years, the Macedonian Parliament adopted few laws that is helping us or need to helping us in the fight in the corruption, and having in mind that Macedonia is one of the most corrupted countries in the Europe. We have the law of preventing of corruption and conflict of interest that was adopted in January 2019. We also have the State Commission for the Prevention of the Corruption. At the Parliament, we adopted the National Strategy for Prevention of Corruption and Conflict of Interest for the period of 2001-2005. We also adopted the Law of Protection of the Whistleblowers. With one sentence, we have all of the necessary regulation. And if we are looking at these facts that I already presented, it seems that the Parliament is fulfilling the role of the preventing and combating or fighting the corruption. But according to the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International, Macedonia is currently ranked as 87th out of 818 countries with the 39 index points, and the previous year we was ranked in 111th place. Just for comparison, in 2014 we was at 64th place. With these numbers, just show that Macedonia it is one of the most corrupted country in Europe, unfortunately. In the latest NDA survey that was concluded last year, when citizens was polled on their general outlook, top concerns, perception about corruption, and confidence in the judiciary and other institutions, and in their abilities to combat corrupt practices. 1/3 believes that the country is moving in the wrong direction overall, citing crime, corruption, and poor governance. The top concerns are reducing corruption and organized crime is conjunction with improving the judicial system, followed by economic concerns and standard of living. Nearly 2/3 from the citizens of Macedonia, or 63%, are dissatisfied with the fight against corruption, and 58% of them do not see government efforts as effective. Furthermore, the law of the Assembly of Macedonia regulates the organization of the oversight hearings in order to obtain information and an expert opinion on issues related to the policy determination and enhancement, implementation of laws, and any other activities of the government and the state administrative body. Unfortunately, unlike the parliamentary mandates that was 2008, 2011, and 2011-2014, when 5 oversight hearings were held, in the current parliamentary composition, only 1 oversight hearing is initiated, and it's not completed. We also have, under the Parliament, the standing inquiry.
Mr. Janushev, can you please wrap up? We are...
Yes, I'm finishing.
Yes, please.
For protection of the civil rights and freedoms, it's established in the Assembly, and these findings are the basis for the initiating a procedure for determining the responsibility of the holders of the public offices, and again, unfortunately, not a single process has been realized. Thank you, and sorry for the time.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Omar Terbak of Algeria, to be followed by Mr. Georgios Varemenos of Greece. Mr. Terbak.
Oui. Madame la Présidente de l'Assemblée parlementaire de la CE, Madame la Présidente du Parlement chypriote, ou bien de la République de Chypre, mes collègues et les différentes représentations parlementaires, premièrement, je tiens à remercier Madame la Présidente du Parlement chypriote pour l'accueil chaleureux. Deuxièmement, je remercie Madame la Présidente pour cette invitation chaleureuse et aussi très significative pour nous, les Algériens. En mon nom et au nom de mes amis et collègues parlementaires algériens, je tiens à remercier tous mes collègues pour cette invitation. Je tiens aussi à vous dire que durant la période de latence causée par la pandémie du Covid, l'Algérie s'est dotée de nouvelles institutions qui sont basées sur la transparence, justement, par le changement de quelques pratiques électorales. Et cela a donné le résultat de nouvelles instances qui sont là pour lutter contre cette corruption qui nous a rongés pendant longtemps. Donc, dans un collectif parlementaire qui se base sur, qui a deux rôles, un rôle législatif et un rôle de contrôle, un contrôle renforcé par cette nouvelle politique du nouveau président qui est Abdelmajid Tebboune. D'ailleurs, il est en train de sillonner le monde, qui commence dans un périple pour revisiter pas mal de pays, pour parler de l'Algérie nouvelle, l'Algérie qui a déjà combattu, qui est en train de combattre la corruption avec tout un arsenal juridique et constitutionnel. Donc, la politique algérienne actuelle se base, ou bien sort d'un rôle, ou bien le régime algérien sort du rôle de créateur de richesse pour un rôle de régulateur qui permet à toute la population de s'inscrire dans cet élan, dans cette nouvelle élan et dans cette nouvelle politique qui se base sur la transparence. Aussi, faut-il le noter, que l'Algérie s'ouvre actuellement sur tout le monde et je vous informe que nous avons une politique pour s'ouvrir tout le monde sur deux principes, en se basant sur deux principes, sur le plan économique, sur le principe gagnant-gagnant et sur le plan politique, sur le respect et la non-ingérence. Voilà. Merci.
Thank you so much. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Georgios Varemenos of Greece, to be followed by Ms. Haima Zemzami of Morocco.
Dear colleagues, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly is taking place at a particularly critical time for democracies and its institutions. Before we can emerge from the 2 years ordeal of the global pandemic, geopolitical tensions and polarizations are returning to the international environment, testify the resilience of international law and transparency in the relationships that define our lives. It is obvious that the depth and quality of our democracies is judged in marginal emergency situations. The real stress test of democracy is the behavior of the public authority in such situations, and not only in normality. Unfortunately, the last 3 years in my country, Greece, we have negative evolutions in the field of state of justice. Protected witnesses of public interest in huge cases of corruption, as the big scandal of Novartis, are threatened openly by governmental officials. In the same time, court officials who investigated scandals are dismissed from their duties and faces legal action. One emblematic case of those is the former prosecutor of corruption, Mrs. Touloupaki, who recently testified in European Parliament. The persecution of Eleni Touloupaki remembers us the case of the Romanian prosecutor Laura Kövesi, who suffered similar persecutions and finally was justified and now is the first European prosecutor. And as if that were not enough, in Greece are persecuted the journalists who investigated major financial scandals and helped to the best of their ability to reveal the truth. It is not coincidence that, according to the ranking of Reporters Without Borders for 2022, Greece is in the worst position among European countries in terms of press freedom, having dropped by 38 places in the world ranking. Furthermore, one investigative journalist, Giorgos Karaivas, a colleague of mine, has been murdered brutally from the mafia, and 1 year later, there are not realistic possibilities the perpetrators to be arrested. Closing my intervention, I would like to wish our next meeting to be held in a more peaceful environment where the corruption would be reduced by practical measures. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will continue with Ms. Zemzani of Morocco, to be followed by Ms. Maria Karapetian from Armenia.
Thank you so much. Mesdames et messieurs, c'est un plaisir et un honneur de se retrouver aujourd'hui au sein du Parlement chypriote. Et je voudrais tout d'abord adresser mes sincères remerciements au Parlement de la République de Chypre pour son hospitalité et la parfaite organisation de cette conférence. Je remercie également la POSCE qui nous donne l'occasion de nous réunir et de débattre des priorités majeures auxquelles nous sommes confrontés. Mesdames et messieurs, en effet, la corruption provoque un effet dévastateur qui peut se manifester sur l'ensemble des composantes de la société, et notamment par la baisse de la qualité des produits et augmentation des prix, la baisse de la qualité des services publics, la baisse des investissements étrangers et fuite des capitaux, des infrastructures hors normes et dangereuses, un système de santé non efficace et un système d'éducation déficient. Ayant conscience des ravages que peut causer la corruption sur tous les secteurs et conformément aux directives de Sa Majesté le roi Mohammed VI, que Dieu l'assiste, le Royaume du Maroc a pour sa part fait de la lutte contre la corruption un défi prioritaire et redouble d'efforts pour en venir à bout, et ce, à travers un bon nombre d'actions et par le seul qualitatif que lui a accordé la Constitution de 2011. Le Royaume du Maroc a développé son arsenal juridique et institutionnel et s'est mis en conformité avec les standards internationaux, notamment en 2007 avec la Convention des Nations Unies contre la corruption. Une stratégie nationale de lutte contre la corruption, première de ce genre au Maroc, a été mise en place, ainsi qu'une commission nationale anticorruption chargée d'assurer sa mise en œuvre. Ces stratégies reposent sur 5 piliers importants, à savoir la gouvernance, la prévention, la répression, la communication, sensibilisation et la formation-éducation. Celle-ci s'étale sur 10 ans et vise à l'horizon 2025 à inverser la tendance de manière irréversible et visible, à renforcer la confiance des citoyens, ainsi qu'à améliorer l'intégrité des affaires et les positionnements du Maroc à l'international. Afin d'atteindre ces objectifs, la stratégie est traduite selon un plan d'action clair et bien défini, basé sur 10 programmes objectivés, incluant 236 projets. Tenue constitutionnelle, l'instance nationale de la probité, de la prévention, de la lutte contre la corruption, quant à elle, vise à instaurer une culture de l'intégrité au Maroc pour faire avancer le chantier de la lutte contre la corruption. Cette autorité administrative a pour objectif également d'attirer les investissements étrangers, encourager les initiatives privées et promouvoir l'égalité d'accès aux services publics. Conformément à la nouvelle législation, celle-ci viendra renforcer l'action pluridimensionnelle menée par le gouvernement et le pouvoir judiciaire en ce domaine. Le rôle du Parlement est central pour promouvoir une bonne gouvernance inclusive et transparente de l'action publique, notamment par la définition du cadre légal qui régit toutes les questions d'intégrité. Les parlementaires, en tant que représentants du peuple, constituent le lien indéfectible entre l'électorat et l'exécutif. À ce titre, ont une responsabilité majeure pour exprimer les préoccupations des citoyens qu'ils représentent. Il est donc important que les lois adoptées par le Parlement de ce point de vue prévoient des mécanismes et des garde-fous pour l'exécution efficace du budget et la gestion rationnelle des deniers publics. Ainsi, mesdames et messieurs, la lutte contre ce fléau doit être érigée en priorité car il s'agit du plus grand obstacle au développement économique et social. Malgré que ce soit un défi difficile, il n'en est pas moins impossible et ensemble, nous parviendrons à y faire face. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Thank you.
And I thank you too. I will continue with Ms. Karapetian of Armenia, to be followed by Mr. Paul Massaro of the United States of America. Ms. Karapetian, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Hassani, for the word. Dear colleagues, I join the expressions of gratitude to the House of Representatives of Cyprus and personally Irene Charalambides for hosting us here. Thank you very much. My colleague Sarkis Khandanyan spoke about the general progress made by Armenia in combating corruption. Transparency International says Armenia is a champion in terms of progress in recent years. This, of course, says something bad about our starting point a few years ago, but it also definitely says something good about the determination of Armenia's current political leadership in combating corruption. I would like to single out one particular legislative change that we have made in spring 2020. 2 years ago, my parliament adopted a law on the civil forfeiture of illegal assets. And currently, there are about 300 studies, cases under study, under investigation. And out of these 300, about a dozen have entered the court. Cumulatively, these dozen cases amount to 125 million euros worth of potentially illegal assets. This, of course, is impressive for the Armenian public, but the important point in the implementation, in the adoption and implementation of this legislation is not so much the mechanism itself as much as the opportunity it gives to the sides that, to the party that is accused of illegal assets to actually negotiate with the state and return these illegal assets on a voluntary basis, hence also acquiring a chance to keep up to 25% of the amount that is being contested in court. In general, this legislation is not a criminal legislation, but a civil proceeding which contributes to this process speeding up, because it is not a conviction, a sentence that people face, but a civil proceeding. The political component of our discussion, Irana talked about political will as being the most important component in combating corruption. I share this position, and I think we all should aim towards making sure that, in fact, there is less and less of political will needed in combating corruption, and more there are institutional capabilities and mechanisms that can take the place of our individual political wills and make more permanent changes on our way to combating corruption. Thank you very much.
I thank you too. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Paul Massaro of the United States, to be followed by the last speaker on my list, Mr. Shane Cazels of Ireland. But Mr. Massaro, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The United States has undergone a complete transformation in the way it understands corruption in the last few years, almost entirely led by Congress. And I want to emphasize that legislatures can play a truly massive role, and in this case played a transformative role from understanding corruption, I think primarily over the last 30 years, as primarily a quid pro quo bribery issue, maybe something seen in development or in developing countries, to one in which we understand that developed countries and Western countries also suffer from a particular variety of corruption. And this is what is known as the enablers. You know, the chairperson, special representative talked about it, or the authoritarian revolving door. This is when we have lawyers, real estate professionals, accountants, former officials, and many others who actually go take blood money and work for dictatorships, thereby undermining our democracies from within. So we have come to view corruption as a national security threat, a weakness that is an opening for foreign dictatorships to exert influence, deleterious influence, in our societies. And I think that, you know, when I look at Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, I see a failure of deterrence that has in large part been the result of elite capture. That is to say, and there are many examples of this, that Western elites at the top and in fact throughout our societies have come to accept money from corrupt dictatorships, thereby affecting their ability to make smart deterrence decisions. High-profile examples include many former heads of government in Europe, like former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, or German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, or former Prime Minister of France, Francois Fillon, but the list goes on. There are former members of Congress that work for Chinese state companies, state-influenced companies, and so on and so forth. So the problem is really across the entire OSCE region. And this is now what we're trying to fight. So we have established in the Congress a caucus that is a congressional group against foreign corruption and kleptocracy. We've passed legislation to abolish anonymous shell companies, which for a long time the United States has been one of the #1 providers of shell companies in the world. In fact, next to Cyprus, which I know Cyprus has done a lot of work on as well. The president has declared corruption a national security threat, and in fact unveiled the first ever US strategy on countering corruption. So the enablers are now our big target. We're looking inward as well as outward, but the fact is corruption is transnational. It is not stuck to any state, and it permeates the entire OSCE region. Thank you.
I thank you too. And let's finish this set of discussion with Mr. Shane Cazals of Ireland. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to touch on the points raised by our OSCE PA Vice President, Ms. Irene, because the importance of the points that she made in respect of the role of the media is as important in this discussion as the role that we play as legislators and the legislation that we enact. The points raise an important question for us all, and one that we probably haven't really touched on, and that is the steady decline in our traditional media sources and newsrooms that broke all of the stories that we've been talking about here today. So if we don't have this level of investigative journalism, how in God's name are we going to actually see those stories come to light? And it is a very serious question for us because they're being usurped by social media companies who are now seen as trusted news sources by huge swathes of our population. And that is very, very worrying. And it came to the fore during the COVID-19 pandemic when the disinformation was allowed to spread at a rapid rate. So if we want to make sure that we have investigative journalism going forward, we as governments are going to have to actually invest in that, something we're probably not used to. We often see the media as a threat and as a dangerous animal. One of our former members here from the UK, the OSCE representative, Mr. John Whittingdale, a former media secretary for the UK, made sure he brought forward a piece of work whereby a percentage fee of the national broadcasting license was used to employ young journalists, and ensure that they had jobs in newsrooms. And there's a practical measure that can be taken. We're looking for practical solutions here today. There's a practical solution that can be taken. In my own government, we have established a Future of the Media Commission to make sure that we're not all crying when our traditional media sources are gone. We're investing now, and I think that's something very important, and I praise our Vice President for bringing it to the floor here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. With this, the set of speakers has finished, but I would like to give the floor quickly, if there are any concluding remarks, to Ms. Hanne Juncker.
Thanks very much. I'm getting the hang of this. No, I want to say that I'm very encouraged and impressed with the very substantial comments that you have shared with us, and also to hear about the national experiences, whether they have been favorable or whether there are still challenges. We're very often asked in Greco, when we speak with our member states, what can we do to reduce corruption? And the obvious answer from our side is, of course, well, you can implement Greco's recommendations, and if they do, that will definitely help at the institutional and constitutional and legal level. But I think what is also key and very difficult is to develop a sense of ownership around integrity in public affairs. If we look at member states where we see high levels or low levels of corruption, this is very often the difference. A genuine, I can only use the word ownership, of what it means to be in public service, and of course what being a parliamentarian means, and leading from that point of view. And that requires time, it requires education from a very early stage, and it requires constant commitment. And I think today you have already proven that you have that commitment. But from our side, that is the way to get from laws, wishes, to implementation, which the very first speaker from Montenegro mentioned, implementation. That is absolutely what we are aiming for. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We don't have any more online Ms. Strobel-Shaw, but I will continue with Ms. Ramasastri.
Thank you. I just, again, listened intently and want to thank you for, again, the depth and breadth of your comments. And actually, it's just a request back to the different delegations that have already made presentations. If you have those in writing, please share them. Again, they were very rich in terms of the comparative experience, so we can take that forward in terms of good practice. Thank you.
And I would like to thank you all for a very interactive debate. We may now proceed to Restaurant Pentadactylos just outside this hall for lunch. Good. How can I say no to
Just a couple of words. Thank you. First of all, I'm very glad we share the same passion, and I'm positive we can do a lot as OSCPA. And also, I thank my colleague from Ireland, because I used to be a journalist myself. And I know that when we have to deal with economic crisis, things are getting very hard to the media. I mean, too much pressure from financial cycles, from political cycles, people who try to control the public opinion. So yes, we have to find ways to secure the independence of media. And tomorrow we are going to discuss it extensively, this matter. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you. Lunch is just outside this hall. The next session will begin sharp at 14:30. Thank you so much for your engagement.